All right, hello, welcome back to the Bacta Tank. I am Michael, your host, and in the studio with me is, of course, David Sabal.
Hello there.
In this episode, we're diving right back into Andor's second season, specifically episodes 7 through 9, or what Gilroy is calling his third narrative arc.
Yes.
Okay, so if you're new to the podcast, you can find us wherever you listen to podcasts. Just search From the Bacta Tank. Be sure to leave us a review, give us a thumbs up. Also, give us a thumbs up on YouTube if you're watching us right now. And wave to my ugly mug.
Our ugly mugs.
Well, I didn't want to include you in that. That would be rude of me.
That would be rude.
I didn't want to assume that you think you're ugly.
Well, dude. I mean, after this, these particular episodes, the way that Syril looked was just terrible.
Well,
I wouldn't want to look like that.
Come on, poor Syril alone, dude. Leave poor Syril alone. Poor man. Hey, speaking of all these odd characters that we've never quite seen in Star Wars before, right? Like Syril, Dedra, Rapist number 1. I want to know, like, did he have a name in the call sheet, or was it Rapist number 1? That's what I want to know.
Yeah.
And also, who's going to be the first brave soul to cosplay Rapist number 1 at San Diego Comic-Con?
I dare that. I dare that to actually happen.
Well, listen, if you're going to put it into Star Wars, then it should be okay to cosplay as Rapist number 1.
Yeah. That is so weird.
And I also want to know if they're going to sell Rapist number 1 at Disneyland.
Have a figure?
Yeah.
They need a
Rapist
figure.
number 1.
Rapist number 1.
The Bix Rapist. It'll be it'll just be one and done. They'll sell one. It'll be worth like $3 million.
It'll be a collectible. It'll be like one of those like limited Star Wars celebration releases.
Or like the George Lucas one.
Oh my
or
God,
the
yeah.
Kylo Ren one from SNL.
From SNL, yeah.
Yeah. Rapist number 1. I think someone should dress up as Rapist number 1 at Disneyland. When they go to Galaxy's Edge, you have Kylo Ren, you have genocidal people, you have Vader, you have Kylo Ren. What's the difference between a rapist and a genocidal maniac?
See, this is what happens with this series. It makes us question these really, really dark
Who's
thoughts.
who's dressing up as Syril at Disneyland?
Oh my God, dude.
Well, explain your character to the kids, boys and girls. Well, I start off as an obsessed mama's boy.
Then I turned into a cuck.
Yeah. Star Wars like this does present problems for Disney.
It does.
This is why Disney buying Star Wars is probably the worst mistake that could have happened for Star Wars fans, because there will always be. This is a once-in-a-lifetime series. I do not believe, even though I think, in my opinion, I'm not going to say definitively, I do think this is the direction Star Wars should take. Add a little more levity. Not everything needs to be super serious. But generally speaking, what this show is doing should serve as a template for future Star Wars series. This is an actual series that would be watched by non-Star Wars fans. It is being watched by non-Star Wars fans.
Yeah.
And if it didn't have the Star Wars title on it and you threw this on HBO as some sci-fi show that delves into rebellion and empire, this would probably be watched just like Game of Thrones is watched if this was on HBO.
Oh, easily. I think Andor season 2 is entering the echelon of, say, Game of Thrones, even Battlestar back in the day. I don't think it'll reach Battlestar heights yet, because everyone under the sun was talking about him. But I'm seeing that basically Andor season 2 is making so much more traction than any other Star Wars show I have seen.
It is, yes, but at the same time, this is the series, retrospectively looking back at everything, what they should have done, this should have been the first series out the gate. Because what Mandalorian did, even though I like Mandalorian did not connect with everyone in a long-term way. The first season connected because it was new, it was fresh. Baby Grogu, or Baby Yoda is what everyone called him at first, was like a phenom.
Yeah.
It was a pop culture hit. But after the first season, many of those non-Star Wars fans that got swept up didn't come back. But if Andor would have been that show, people probably would have come back because this show is not just novelty for non-Star Wars fans. This is a viable, dramatic narrative series.
I mean, it's amazing to me that Andor season 2, you realize it is actually being talked about as Emmy worthy.
Yeah,
I would never think a Star Wars show, Mike, in my lifetime would ever say, yeah, that's Emmy worthy. There's a lot of actors on there that deserve a nod.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is not about this being so much better than Star Wars. This is just being developed and executed very different than prior Star Wars installments.
Yeah.
Star Wars has never focused on nuanced complexity. That's not what Star Wars is. But this is why I posed the question on our first discussion for Andor Season 2. Should this be the template for future Star Wars? I believe it should, but I will not definitively answer that until our next discussion.
Yeah.
But this entire little part that we're talking about right now, David, actually feeds right into a bunch of other thoughts that I've had about this series. This series, in so many ways, has really cracked open the door on so many different possibilities for Star Wars in the way of storytelling, fleshing out cosmology and bringing Star Wars back to its scrappy roots of rebellion. The Force as, or I should say, and including the Force as like a cosmological necessity.
Yes.
While truly pronouncing the effects of war and rebellion, but not just in the form of moral ambiguity, which is what a lot of people are focusing on. And I get why when it comes to Andor, or even the constituent moral contrition that comes with a rebellion. But the psychic cost. This is something that Gilroy and his team have also effectively captured. The phenomenology of rebellion as something psychologically visceral, disorienting, and destabilizing.
Yes. It's like, the thing I really like, especially these past 3 episodes, particularly these ones, they really hammer home that notion that you just brought up, that Gilroy from the get-go has mentioned off and on in various interviews of what his themes for Andor were supposed to be, showing that the rebellion is not just all good, that it is messy. Having a rebellion is messy, where it's neither, sometimes it might be the right thing to do, sometimes it might be the wrong thing to do, especially like when you take into context about the Gorman massacre. It could have been averted. The problem was no one was listening, and they basically went ahead, the Gormans did, and you see what happens.
Yeah. And the people who survive, it's, again, no one's thinking moral cost necessarily in the moment. Meaning these characters aren't thinking, well, is this the morally right thing to do? When you really think about it, yes, the moral questions that are being posed are more for the audience themselves in a lot of ways. But this is about psychological trauma.
Yes.
The people who must live on after the rebellion, who now have to reconcile the things they have done for the very freedoms that they may or may not be able to enjoy once they, I guess you can say, win the day, so to speak. So it's not just about depicting what rebellion looks like, but immersing the viewer in what it actually feels like from the inside, moment to moment, as experienced by those living through it. That's what Gilroy has done so precisely in this series. Essentially, what I'm speaking about is the psychic anguish of war.
Yes.
That's something that a lot of directors, filmmakers have attempted to delve into. One of the few that have done it one director, I should say, that has done it very well is Terrence Malick.
Yes.
Specifically in A Thin Red Line.
Yeah.
It's completely dealing with psychic anguish and the cost of living on after war and seeing what becomes of the very actions you take for the so-called good. So, and I suppose what I like most about the series, besides what we had just gone over, the obvious, is how the show shows everyone else. The series, I should say. I shouldn't say show and show back to back. That's going to confuse people. David, I
Yes.
should learn how to speak properly. It's about how the series shows what Star Wars can be. As
There
I
you
have been saying numerous times, alongside Rogue One, this series proves that you can create something that feels like Star Wars, using its familiar conventions, while still doing something entirely new. And I'm not just talking about narrative or plot. That's something that we've already discussed, and we'll, as I've said numerous times now, we'll talk about at a later date.
Yes.
I mean the form itself.
Mhm.
And this is one of the very few contemporary streaming series, or post-network television, as they call it, that's using the medium formally to tell stories in structurally different ways. For example, Andor, the series, is broken into 3 episode arcs, not just as segmented narratives, but as formally unified units. So the arcs aren't 3 standalone episodes that add up to a story. They're conceived as a single structural whole that requires all 3 parts to function. And it's not a film chopped into thirds.
Yes.
It's not. And it's not traditional serialized TV. It's actually a unique hybrid form. We have not seen a show quite like this. The only example I can point to that's very similar is Sherlock on BBC.
Yes. That's the one that a lot of like the BBC shows tend to go this route.
They
where
experiment.
they experiment with the format of their series, because over in Europe, their version of streaming or viewing television is much different than here in the States,
Yeah.
where over there they deal with like the type of format where you have like these segmented episodes that combine into one narrative, and you can have like 5 episodes that basically is one story arc, and then suddenly the entire series changes because they're doing a different story arc.
Yeah.
And it can be very confusing to like people, to audiences that aren't used to that.
Traditional viewers, yeah.
Yeah. But like, I am incredibly impressed how Tony Gilroy and his staff have taken that and said, we're going to bring that over to the stateside, and it's going to work.
Well, I don't even know if absolutely everyone's post-structuralism, right? Everyone's borrowing something from someone. So I'm not going to say Gilroy isn't borrowing from that strategy, but my main point is that we have a new medium, and we have forgotten that. It's called streaming.
Mm-hmm.
And with a new medium, you should probably use it to create new styles of entertainment. I'm not against changing the style of television and or movies. I know I get the unfair reputation of being a stickler for convention because I'm a traditionalist when it comes to movies, but I'm also up for experimentation when it's done by people who know what they're doing. And it goes right back to what we always say. If you know the rules, you can break them. And this is an example of a man, Tony Gilroy, who knows the rules, and he's breaking them, and he's also using the medium to do something that we're not accustomed to. He's using the medium in a way that allows him to tell a very specific type of story. The way it's told, the way it's rolled out from episode to episode. The upside is that we're getting deeply layered, long-form storytelling.
Yes.
The downside is that individual episodes don't always stand on their own, and we'll probably get deeper into that in our final discussion.
Yeah, because like that in itself is like an entire new thing that Andor has brought, not just to Star Wars, but to the viewing audience. How, in a lot of ways, Andor is doing something that all the shows that every single streaming network like Netflix, Amazon, Disney Plus, all of them, they always try to release a series that tries to set the bar, set the tone. And not just for the audience, but for a production style to make it easy for them. And Tony Gilroy is actually doing that with Andor.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of discussion amongst particular film theorists and scholars who say that who pose the question, is it time to possibly reevaluate how we tell our stories within television parameters? But I'm speaking of streaming specifically, and so were they.
Mm-hmm.
Because we have this new medium,
Mm-hmm.
it should be different, not the same. We already had, look, when you went from radio to television, there were similarities at first, but quickly people realized that with television, you can do something completely different. You don't have to follow the same rule book as radio. But it took them about 10 years roughly to figure that out, and then they ended up finding their own little groove within the television realm. But then when we moved to cable certainly opened up some potential.
Oh my God, yeah.
But it was more on the maturity side.
Yes.
It didn't really change the game. Streaming comes along, and we're probably about 15 years roughly into streaming, maybe 10 if you want to say solid like streaming in terms of competition, not just one player. And we're still basically just doing TV. And I'm okay with that. I think largely we should do that. But except for, say, the Black Mirror on Netflix, there really aren't a lot of shows that are experimenting with what they can do with form and style via the medium of choice.
No, that's very true. I mean, like, it's like one of those.
Can you think of any other shows that look to reinvent and they do it properly?
Properly is the big thing.
The binge model originally was this idea of a new way of releasing things. But what they're doing is they're still abiding by general television rules, but without the episode-to-episode payoff. It's designed for you to watch in a binge format, in a one-stop sit setting.
Mm-hmm.
And then you get the impact and you understand the flow of the show, because there are so many, 99% of streaming shows, specifically on Netflix, if you watch just one episode, you're like, this is a TV show?
Yeah, you're lost.
There really isn't the appropriate structure that's designed to keep your interest from episode to episode, because as Ted Sarandos has said himself, we don't design our stories to be ingested one episode at a time. We don't seek to tell stories in one episode. We seek to tell stories in one sitting, in a 10-episode arc. And that's not really a great way of telling stories, because there's no intensity. There's no dramatic, there's no drama being layered in, no suspense. Because if there are no markers that tell you when to start pulling back, to start building up the suspense because this episode's about to end, then what you end up getting is a lot of meandering narratives. And that's exactly what we're getting.
Well, that's the thing is like, it goes back to like what me and you have stated is we don't mind when people experiment. However, just because it's okay to experiment, you see a lot of bad filmmakers and TV makers. At that point, you see a lot of like bad executions. And that's when bad television happens, bad films happen.
Well, that's what plagued, in my opinion, both Book of Boba Fett and Ahsoka.
Oh, yeah.
They didn't try to adhere to any narrative structure, really. They tried to make elongated movies, and you can't make a 10-hour movie.
Because it just meanders at that point. And there's no emotional connection that you can get.
There are specific structural cues that are needed in order to give us a subconscious aha.
Yeah.
It helps us follow the invisible markers that are laid out.
And that's why when you ask about like, oh, is there any television series that I can think of that didn't just do it, but did it right? The only ones that could pop in my head, Black Mirror, which is a recent one.
Yeah.
And Sherlock from the BBC.
Yeah.
Those were the only ones that basically, yeah, they did it right. And the only negative of that format, especially with Sherlock, I see a lot of fans turn on that series because, oh, well, it's too short. Like, we didn't get enough.
Yeah, but every season is basically a trilogy. There are 3 movies.
Yeah,
So I'm not complaining. You're giving me 3 movies, essentially?
exactly.
Yeah. All right. So as for the specifics of this episode, there's a lot. A lot definitely transpired during these last 3 episodes.
Oh, my God. Yeah.
Number 1, David, and this goes right back to a point that I made. The Force is present as it should. I had said that if it's Star Wars, there always needs to be some connection to the Force.
You got to give us something.
And sure enough, in the 7th episode, we are introduced to the idea that Cassian is more important in the greater Star Wars cosmology, as he was referred to as a messenger. This is such a subtle but incredibly important revelation for us Star Wars fans, and not because it simply subverts by retrospectively bestowing some label of importance on a leader or character in our series, but it foregrounds Andor, the character, as a cosmological necessity, not a pawn, not some rando rebel officer, I should say, but as someone who's doing the work of the living Force, where he's Force sensitive, or he's a pivotal, or I should say whether he's Force sensitive, Dave, or he's a pivotal component to the machinations and designs of the living Force, really doesn't matter.
Yeah.
What it does is lend credence and more oomph to his story, making him far more relevant than just some random spy, but a necessity that aids in paving a path to the eventual destruction of the Empire, because without his actions, there would be no rebellion for Luke to join and eventually bring an end to the Sith.
Exactly. And this was one of the ones that I was very interested to see how Tony Gilroy handles in his narrative, because as I mentioned 1 or 2 episodes ago when we were covering this, Tony Gilroy cannot take anything away from Rogue One, because remember, Rogue One was that pivotal moment when all the rebellion stands up, and the main character of that was Jyn Erso. She's the one who galvanized everybody in the very end, where, you know, she gets the whole band together and basically says, let's do this. Let's get the plans. And then you have Andor, Cassian, following her at that point. And I remember me and you talking about it on the show, and I was like going, I'm hoping that Tony Gilroy does not take away from the importance of that character. And sure enough, he handles Cassian perfectly, in my opinion, in these 3 episodes, because in a way he opens up the idea that everyone is important in the universe of Star Wars.
David, don't say that. What are you, Dave Filoni? If you work hard with a little effort, no, David, that's not it.
But here's the thing. Here's the thing, though. Tony Gilroy actually makes it work, though.
Listen, not everyone's important in Star Wars. There are characters that are just people, David. I get your point.
Yeah.
I understand your point, which is...
It sounds grandiose.
I think your point... without... Okay, so where I can agree, I'm not going to speak for you, but where I can agree is that I agree that in order to privilege one character, don't bring down another.
Yes.
Because she was already established as a firm leader and an important figure within that particular moment. But also, you got to remember who's keeping an eye on her, who decides whether he's going to kill her or not kill her.
Yes.
It's all Andor.
It's all Andor.
And this goes right back to what Gilroy said. I want to say a couple weeks ago, that when we are done watching this, we will see Rogue One completely different. It'll be a completely different perspective, because there's going to be so much background framing and relevance being put on other characters, and we're now going to be able to point to moments in Rogue One and know exactly how that happened, why it happened. And this is largely working because he isn't reinventing the wheel when it comes to what Lucas has done. He's borrowing the form and style of Lucas. And I'm not talking genre conventions. Oh, well, there's a samurai vibe here, so it's like Star Wars, which is what a lot of people point to when they're trying to compare, let's say, Ahsoka to particular influences of Lucas or the pulps. This isn't just relying on genre conventions or genre similarities. He's literally pulling Lucas's writing playbook and using it. He's using the exact same aspects. He understands the Force, David, better than apparently everyone else that does the show.
Does that make you just angry? Especially like the beginning of episode 7, I'm like going, thank you. Finally, someone, after how long, Mike, finally establishes the importance of the Force and not just using Jedis and Sith and lightsabers.
Now, going back to what you said, where I poo-pooed on it, this is, again, where I can agree, where you said he's kind of showing how everyone's somewhat important. Now, let me qualify that a bit so that I can agree with it better, okay? If that's okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So whereas Dave Filoni created some weird idea that if you work hard, everyone can touch the Force.
Everyone can touch the Force.
I'm paraphrasing, but that was the stupidity of Sabine suddenly having the Force. That was his justification.
That was his justification.
Whereas here, with Andor, Gilroy takes the very explanation that Lucas has given with the Force, as well as how it's described in Star Wars. The living Force is an energy field that binds the galaxy
together.
It binds everything. So, in essence, the Force would be working through everyone. But that doesn't mean everyone could see it or feel it or manipulate it. That's saved for people who can actually see the Force-sensitive individuals. So, in that way, David, I think you're right. If you want to work with me here, we can rework your thought there.
No.
But you get, because I think that was your point.
Yeah, that is the point that I was actually pointing to, is like, when you look at like what he was able to do, and you like go, wait a minute, we've been trying so long, Mike, with all the series that we've been, even, take Acolyte, take Ahsoka, take Mandalorian, when they started delving into the Force. And, just like what you said, it's amazing to me that the Lucas Story Group heads, that we've always said they know what they're doing. They know how Star Wars works. But every single time they do something, it shows that they don't.
No, they know how to mimic superficially. This goes right back to what Thomas was talking about in our Patreon discussion about counter narratives. Like, there's a lot of people that want to do different things that they see, but they're doing it because it might look cool. They might understand it's superficial. They might understand its superficial implications, but they don't actually know why you do it and how you utilize it. This is an example, Tony Gilroy coming in and doing just those things. So in an interview, he did say that, let me pull this up real fast. So showrunner Tony Gilroy has emphasized a subtle integration of the Force into Andor, aiming to explore themes of reluctant destiny without overtly introducing Jedi elements, which is smart.
Yes.
In an interview, Gilroy noted that the rarity of Force awareness in the galaxy and expressed a desire to depict it in a nuanced manner. The Force healer's interaction with Cassian hence suggests she perceives a significant presence of destiny within him, referring to him as a messenger with a specific purpose. So even though, David, going back to what you're saying, that everyone has a part to play, there's some relevance and importance to every player, he stands above at this moment.
Yes.
He is the relevant figure. He is the most important apparatus that the Force is working through. And I couldn't be happier. That's all I wanted, David. At the very beginning of the season, I said, all I expect from anything Star Wars is even if you want to be more grounded or you want to kind of move away from the Jedi, You got to throw in something pertaining to the Force. Otherwise, it's not Star Wars because the Force penetrates everything. It binds the galaxy. And in many ways, is the very way the story is narrated. Meaning, if you go back to our Jedi teachings, way back when George Lucas talked about the wills, his original plan, the entire project of Star Wars is essentially a meta-narrative. It's being told.
Yes.
The Skywalker saga is being told to us.
Yeah. And it's hilarious to me when I think about it now, because it's kind of like, me and you have been Star Wars fans for a very long time. And we've seen our fair share of people trying to do this, try to actually give some gravitas to the Force. And they do things like, let's make a centralized, kooky type of term to actually explain the Force. And yet Tony Gilroy does like this masterwork of showing how you can do it subtly.
What?
You don't have to come up with these like strange things like what they did in Force Awakens. I hate to say it, with, what was the term they used that they tried to explain what Rey and
A dyad?
the dyad. They come up with like terms like that to sound smart.
Yeah.
And yet Tony Gilroy is like, no, I don't have to come up with terms like that. You just have to explain it as it is naturally.
And yet, what did I say during our last discussion? Even though he's not using the typical Star Wars binary of good and evil, he's still using numerous binaries.
Yeah.
So he gets it. He's taking what Star Wars is, and he's doing exactly what Lucas has continually encouraged the new arbiters of Star Wars.
He deserves the cowboy hat.
Yeah, possibly, David. Because do you remember that's what George Lucas had said? That, okay, this is pretty great, but why don't you do something different?
Yeah.
He said his biggest problem with current Star Wars, he said this 5 years ago, is that they're doing things that we've seen before. And his point was, every movie that I have done, you don't see repeat things. You see some worlds that need some repeat worlds that are very important to the overall story that you'll see, but I introduce new planets, new ships, new ideas, new characters. And what new Star Wars is doing, according to Lucas, and I agree with him, is that they're just taking things that he's done, reworking it slightly, or actually reusing things he's done and saying, do you remember this?
Yes.
This is what we're talking about right now here with Andor. What Tony Gilroy is doing is exactly what George Lucas has advocated for. Doing something new. How many different things have we seen in this series, David, that we've never seen before in Star Wars?
Oh, yeah.
They have done more for Star Wars than the prior the preceding 9 years.
I hate to say it, yeah. Almost close to more than what Filoni has done.
Dude, I don't hate the sequel trilogy like a lot of people do, but my biggest problem is they don't introduce anything new.
Yeah, they don't. They really don't.
There's no new understanding of the Force. As you said, the dyad, that was a new idea, but come on, you didn't even work for that. That was literally pulled deep from your asshole.
It was a MacGuffin.
Yeah, that was in your asshole.
It was just a straight MacGuffin that they used.
Yeah. So, David, bringing it back to Cassian and the Force. So, among fans, of course, opinions are divided. Some believe that Cassian is not Force sensitive, but is instead someone through whom the Force operates, guiding his actions and survival. Now, Gilroy has not stated whether or not he's Force sensitive or the Force is just simply working through him, and I don't believe he will.
Yeah,
and I think it's better just to leave it open for interpretation.
Yeah.
But my own interpretation is that he might be slightly Force sensitive because David, he was uncomfortable with the Force healer because I think he has felt things before and sensed things before.
That's a good point.
I'm not saying he's on the level of even Sabine, who's very weak in the Force.
No.
I'm saying that there's something in him that he senses it in some way, because his eyes went straight to that Force healer as well. And
that's
he was immediately uncomfortable. Now, you could say that could be that discomfort is simply the fact that he doesn't want to be filled with any type of mystic hope that he doesn't believe in.
Yeah.
And I would say that's a valid interpretation as well.
And that's the thing. I really like how it's open to interpretation, because you see it as he's Force sensitive. I see it as I want in my own headcanon, I'm like telling myself, no, it's the Force that's working through him.
Yeah, I'm somewhere in the middle with that, because I don't know in the traditional definition of Force sensitive, I don't feel that that's what Andor is.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like there's something there that he's aware of, that he kind of feels that he's being guided.
Yeah. And it's very much, it reminds me of like the beginning of Rogue One, how they treated, Jyn Erso's family, how they believed in these crystals.
Correct, yeah.
And they didn't overtly say, oh, they're Force sensitive and they can control these crystals. No, they treated it much like how religion is seen.
It seemed to be a belief in the esoteric.
Yes.
It did.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that's what I was like going with this particular thing. I love, number one, how it's open to interpretation, because it reminds me of like the one thing I've always felt a lot of filmmakers need to do. You don't have to give the answer to the audience.
No.
Let the audience come up with their own answers, and then the audience can talk amongst themselves. Yeah. It's like Blade Runner.
As long as it's not like the Sopranos series finale.
Yes.
I mean, that type of leaving it open for interpretation, you can go jump off a cliff with that type of
it's
with
like
that type of open interpretation.
The thing I tell people that is an example of like why I love that knowledge and don't give the answer to your audience all the time is a sci-fi movie like Blade Runner.
Yeah.
You don't give away the answer. You let the audience come up with their own answer.
It destroys something. It's no different than finding out who the alien was at the end of the thing.
Yeah.
Do we really want to know?
Do we want to know?
That takes away the entire mystique.
Yeah. And whether or not Cassian is Force sensitive or not doesn't change his story. It just means that basically there is, just like what you said earlier, there's that Force element that is needed in Star Wars to make it feel like Star Wars.
Yeah.
That whole thing with Cassian where, you have the Force healer right there. I'm not this might sound like, overblowing this, but that whole scene made me feel more about the Force than anything that Ahsoka could do with Hayden Christensen.
Oh, that's hard. That's hard to say, man.
Well, because like
that one episode was pretty fucking great.
It was good.
But I think what mars that episode is that nothing came of it.
Exactly. But nothing comes of it.
Yeah.
And like, but here you have this moment that basically shows the greater aspect of how big the universe of Star Wars is, and yet it is tied by this unifying force that, as Yoda said, surrounds us and binds us and brings us all together.
Yeah. Yep. All right. So let's talk about Syril. Man.
Dude.
David, well, maybe I should give myself a pat on the back because I did call it out for both Dedra and Syril.
Yes.
So it didn't, but okay. I like that I figured it would end this way.
Yeah.
But I didn't think it would end quite like this, but it's very fitting. So you have a character like Syril, okay, who has delusions of grandeur, who willingly went down a path that he didn't fully investigate, didn't really understand. You can say there is some naivety there, absolutely, but he also purposely or willingly didn't really investigate what this really meant. He looked at it as more glory brought to him. I'm finally going to be validated. This is the best moment in my life. I'm finally getting what I deserve. And he may have a lot of what you would call poor character flaws, but he isn't a bad person. He's a man who's about rule of law. That
Yes.
doesn't make someone bad. And that's why I was saying I don't know if he is going to be okay with the complete destruction of a planet. And sure enough, going into the very first episode of this third arc, you immediately see that there's a lot of things at play that he is upset about, that he is disturbed with, because he sees now what is happening, because he isn't a dumb person. What
Yeah.
he is he suffers with a type of narcissism where he needs validation, and that was his priority. And his end is the most fitting for someone like him.
Yes.
When Andor looks at him and says, "Who are you?"
Yeah.
He dies a nobody, which is what he was trying so hard not to be.
do. Exactly. Dude, that whole scene was so poetic
Absolutely.
for Syril that for a moment, because I've seen online that a lot of people are like debating, is Syril's death one of the most tragic deaths in Star Wars? And I'm like going, you can see it as a tragic death.
It's hubris.
But yeah, you can also, a part of me does not see his death as tragic because it's about hubris. He chose this. He wasn't forced into this. He did it. So the part of me for a tragedy is like, you're forced into something you have no control over. Syril had control because, just like you said, he's a man built on law and order. He just blindly believed that without doing anything to look into it because he was so blinded by, no, this is the right thing I have to do. I have to do this.
And he was concerned with what it meant for him.
Yes. And then like to have it suddenly this whole time where he's been hunting Cassian. And then all of a sudden Cassian's like, who are you?
Yeah. And then he dies.
And then he dies. And it's one of those cruel moments that I always giggle at because it's kind of like, it's the joke that you're not your best friend's best friend. And then you see the person shatter.
Yeah.
You know, that is something that I've never seen done.
I would say it is a form of tragedy. If we're speaking like in terms of literature and narrative, it is, because typically the person who suffers from the tragedy or meets their tragic end, typically the person who in fact meets their tragic end is largely responsible for their tragic fall.
Tragic fall. That's a one way of seeing it.
So, I mean, that's, if you study Attic tragedy, you know, Greek, Athens, Athenian tragedy, that's pretty much all of their, even Shakespearean tragedy, same thing. The characters themselves bring about their fall. That's the tragedy. So I would say it's definitely, in terms of literature, it's definitely a tragic end to Syril, and it is fitting. It's one of the best ways you can end his story. And when you look at Dedra, now she's going to have to live with not just the fact that she is responsible for the destruction of a planet, for genocide, but also the death of someone she obviously cared for.
Yes. She's going to be responsible for the death of the one person that she honestly had feelings for.
Yeah. Yes.
And
I think that is what is lost on a lot of people. I don't see a lot of people talking about that aspect. She's someone who she's buttoned up.
Yeah.
She doesn't show emotion, and yet she does with Syril at that moment, and that gives it away to the audience that she is a human. She does have feelings, and this is why she didn't want this job.
Exactly.
That's why it was the moment Krennic looked at her and asked her those questions, there was dread on her face. She knew what this mission meant.
Yeah, and then this was the culmination, or at least the proof that this whole time the audience is made to believe that Dedra is evil. But I'm like going, no, you guys have to wait to see, because there's more going into her character.
Did people actually think she was evil? Because I never.
Oh yeah, there's a lot. There's some people online saying that Dedra's evil.
I think there's a lot of people who are just very binary in the way they look at everything and
Yeah.
everyone, because I never once thought Dedra was evil.
But yeah, that's the ultimate thing, is like a lot of people now are pointing out to those people, you cannot look at Andor in a binary fashion.
Now, I'm not saying evil is not at play.
Oh yeah.
What she did was an evil act.
Mhm.
But evil actions doesn't make someone evil. She is responsible, but you also have to remember in many ways, she too is also a victim. I see a lot of people throwing out that stupid Nazi cliche, I was just following orders. It's more than that.
Yeah.
She was raised within the Imperial Kinder block.
Yeah.
She doesn't know anything else. And I would say that it says a lot about her as a person, deeply as a person, that despite being brainwashed and raised within this ideology, she has a conscience.
Yeah.
How does that happen? That actually says that she's a good person inside. She's just been shaped by imperial ideology. Do you get what I'm saying?
Oh no, absolutely. Because
Someone who's evil doesn't feel the weight of their sin.
someone that is evil, Mike. Think about this. The whole scene with Syril and Dedra. An evil person is not going to let someone strangle them.
Yeah.
And Dedra allowed Syril. She didn't want to fight him. She didn't want to actually do anything. In fact, instead of getting angry at him, you can. And I put this scene as a good example of how good this cast acts. Also, like how they do their work.
Mm-hmm.
The actress that plays Dedra made me truly believe that basically you look at how Dedra reacts to Syril, and it's not out of anger. There is fear in her eyes when she's like worried she's going to lose him.
Yeah.
An evil person doesn't do that. There isn't an evil person doesn't have fear of losing someone. They have the only fear that they have is losing themselves, not someone else.
Yeah.
But you also see Bix and Cassian. Their relationship kind of comes to an end because Bix decides not to follow Cassian. And it's almost, you look at that, and that's where the parallels have to be. Because you have Cassian, and I guarantee you, next episodes, we're going to have Cassian against Dedra now.
Yeah.
Because both of them have lost their significant others in a way. I don't think Bix will ever come back. That's why a lot of people have been wondering about that character.
She's done.
She's done.
She's done. They just did an Ahsoka. They're removing her so they can bring her back later.
Yeah.
I am totally guessing. I'm probably wrong. But
she's at this point, she's never going to see Cassian again.
it would feel like a disservice if she has been somewhat morbid most of the season, going through like her own psychological trauma, only to be killed off a few episodes later.
Yeah.
So that's the only reason why. Now, if this was a hack writer, then I would throw my hands up and say, I have no idea what's going to happen.
Yeah.
But we know Gilroy isn't a hack, and knowing that he's not a hack, which sounds a little silly and maybe a little ironic, there's a little bit of predictability there.
Yeah.
He's not going to just throw away this character. And also, it serves the story purpose. It aids in pushing Andor's story forward.
Yes.
He's hindered by Bix because he wants to live out a happy life with her. And she knows, because obviously she's a believer in the Force, she believes that he is important and that she is a distraction and a roadblock, and then she's going to remove herself so that he can be what he needs to be.
And think about it. Think about the cool parallel now you have.
I know.
You have Bix, who removes herself from Cassian to go fulfill his destiny.
Mm-hmm.
You have Syril, who removes himself from Dedra to make Dedra.
Did he remove himself, though?
Well, the thing is like, yes, you're right.
In terms of grouping, I get it.
In terms of grouping, because like if you think about like how each character is going to actually change at this point, both Dedra and Cassian almost are in the same parallel spots.
Okay, so do you think... That's an interesting thought, David. So just like Cassian, we know what Cassian's going to do. So we know that Bix's actions is going to pay off. He becomes who he needs to be. So you're saying that Syril might be Dedra's only connection to her humanity.
Exactly.
And now that he's gone, she is going to go full on evil.
She could go full on evil.
Interesting.
Or she could do something different than Cassian.
Meaning?
She could go the opposite route, where Cassian will fulfill his destiny by the Force, how the Force guides him. Or Dedra basically does the opposite and shows the opposite route. She's not going to actually follow the Imperial. She'll go and give up everything. She doesn't want to fight anymore.
Yeah.
You'll see her quit the Imperials. Now, I know a lot of people will say, "Oh, that shouldn't forgive that character." No, it's not about forgiveness.
Yeah.
It's really about showing everyone has their choice.
Right.
So, like, because ultimately, we all know Cassian's fate. His fate is on that planet, hugging Jyn as they get blown up. That is their destiny. Well, then, because I'm having a lot of faith in Tony Gilroy and how he's playing around with narrative structures and all these really cool writing methods he's using, I could see him playing around. Yeah, I'm showing that basically there's destiny, but I'm also I'm going to show that basically there's also, you can choose the opposite. You can fight destiny.
All right, David. I like where you're going with this because during our last discussion, coming up just in a few days, we're going to get into that destiny aspect because it goes right back to what I was saying about meta narratives. It's all type of meta fuckery going on.
Yes.
Because we are dealing with a mythic narrative where destiny is at play, both diegetically and, when you think about it, extra diegetically in the real world, because Rogue One, we've all seen it. Andor's story is written. Therefore, if you look at this from a meta perspective via the Wills who are writing this story or telling this story, his fate is already written.
Yes.
That's the genius of this series and Star Wars at large, at least Lucas's version of Star Wars. Okay, David, let's talk about Mon Mothma.
Man.
And then we got to close out the
too.
show. We're already pushing an hour here.
Yeah.
The thing I want to say about that whole aspect is not only is Mon Mothma Genevieve O'Reilly. That's her name, correct? Just continually, consistently knocks it out the park with what she's given. And I could say that about pretty much every character, but her speech,
oh my God, dude.
It was so powerful. It was the thing of what's the word I'm looking for? Of inspiration.
Yes.
When you talk about rebellion and fighting against tyranny, her words and her speech as a whole is what you hear. It just embodies the rebellious spirit, the pushing back on tyranny. Is incredibly powerful and very effective. But in terms of story world, David, I absolutely liked that they made it a shock when people started dying around her. And I'll tell you why, David. Because largely Star Wars in live action has operated in backwater planets where there is no law. It's a very lawless world. And
Yes.
we have come to think that in the world of Star Wars, you just pull a blaster out and you shoot a motherfucker.
Exactly.
And everyone's used to it because
Everyone's
it's
used
what
to it.
happens. And
Yes.
largely, when you look at the planets we've delved into, Tatooine. And then you're fighting a war. So, yes, you're going to shoot your enemies. But we forget that in the core worlds, it's civilized, air quotes. You don't shoot people.
Yes.
You don't just pull out a blaster and kill a motherfucker. And I like that they, what's the word I'm looking for? They outline that. They emphasize that, showing us yet another layer to the workings of Coruscant, because we just think, Coruscant, the Empire, Jedi, people are killing people willy-nilly. But no, it was an actual surprise to Mon Mothma when Andor started killing people. And again, that just brings more nuance to the world of Star Wars.
Yes.
Have we ever seen civility in this way in Star Wars?
No. And that's the brilliant thing is that I feel this is one of those elements that I basically said what you mentioned, like a couple of, and I'm sure we'll cover it in our final thesis and in our final episode covering Andor, but like the whole idea of this being a Star Wars series. When do we say that basically you've gone too far? The whole ship of Theseus comment.
Yeah.
When you start changing the pieces, when does it cease being what it is?
Yeah.
And this was one of those moments when I'm like going, ooh, getting really close. I mean, is this what Star Wars is? But then, you know, my brain starts thinking about it and says, yeah, Star Wars is this because I keep going back to the fact that George Lucas himself said it is called Star Wars. It is a war film.
Right.
It's supposed to be showing war is hell, basically.
Right.
Now, because of like how Lucas wanted to get his message across, he knew he couldn't go too far. But nowadays, maybe the audience is ready. So maybe he could, if Lucas was still around, he could go this dark. He could have gone this way. So in a way, what we saw Andor do makes sense in Star Wars because it's just like what you said. We deal with a universe where literally the outskirts are the Badlands, and we expect people. Yeah, people have slavery. There's terrible atrocities going outside, but there's this weird, kid-friendly veneer that's always been around Star Wars.
We forget that there's Compton and then Scottsdale.
And Compton and Scottsdale. That is a good way of putting it.
Like, just because we've never seen Star Wars version of Scottsdale or Star Wars version of Beverly Hills, let's say, doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So I did like that. I feel like that's something that has been overlooked. And it goes to show you that Tony Gilroy is about fleshing out more layers to Star Wars. He isn't about just regurgitating and showing us more of the same. He's interested in taking what Lucas has done and doing what other people should be doing that are hired to do Star Wars, fleshing it out.
Yes.
Not changing it.
And you know what's even better is the fact that someone pointed this out, that basically Tony Gilroy also was able to kind of flesh out, if you're a Rebels fan,
yeah,
he helped flesh out the whole, start of the rebellion with Mon Mothma. Now we as Rebels fans understand why Mon Mothma is here at this point when we watch. And Tony Gilroy didn't step on any toes. He didn't just trample all over the idea of Rebels. He actually fleshed it out.
Yeah. And what they did with Mon Mothma, ultimately, and I'm sure the next 3 episodes will not change this, is they proved that she is the righteous and rightful leader of the rebellion.
Oh, yeah.
By showing her naivety and showing her shock that people are being shot around her, it shows that she is a completely different type of not just politician, but rebel. And she is the one that will inherit the role of leader because she's the one that is right for that position. Not Luthen.
Yes.
Not even Andor.
Yeah.
Because they are doing things that obviously push the boundaries morally. And typically in the real world, that doesn't, I don't believe in cosmic justice in that regard or in that way, but just in terms of literature and storytelling, these are the types of things in Western thought that we are accustomed to.
Yeah.
That the people who do morally wrong things or morally questionable will not be the ones that are designated or labeled as the righteous ones.
Yes.
there will always be other heroes. That's why when you look at Westerns, if you want to dig into some revisionist, or not even revisionist, just some Western film theory or structuralist thought, it's quite clearly stated in nearly every Western that the cowboy at the end of the story does not get the girl. John Wayne does because he's a white hat.
Yes.
But the revisionist Western, the black hat, he usually has to ride off back into the hills. He doesn't get to enjoy what he just fought for, whether it be the city itself or the town, I should say, or the lady.
Yes. He has to walk away.
So these are all very similar, I guess you can call them writing tropes that have just been accepted in Western thought, generally speaking.
Mm-hmm. And that's what I like, too, is like this idea that this whole season, actually, Luthen has been hammering at Mon Mothma how people like him and Andor are sacrificing they're sacrificing their soul to win. And they understand that. They understand what it's going to take. And for the longest time, it always seemed like, oh, Luthen's trying to, quote unquote, seduce Mon Mothma into his way of thinking. But in a lot of ways, especially these last 3 episodes, to me, Luthen is trying to protect Mon Mothma because he sees her as, just like what you said, that righteous character that can lead a rebellion, that can't be tainted by what him, Saw Gerrera, and Andor have to do.
Yeah, he wants to protect her because he knows that she is the virtuous leader.
The virtuous leader. She's the one that's going to galvanize the troops. And that's what I loved about her speech, because it was very reminiscent of those very classic examples of a civil rights speech, where it gets you properly. It's supposed to be very righteous. It's supposed to be telling you this is something that we need to be doing for the greater good. From a person who is that beacon of hope and beacon of goodness, I guess you could say, that all of us can say is perfect, I guess you could say.
I get what you're saying. All right, David, let's bring our show to an end. I want to thank everybody for listening. Be sure to find us on iTunes, give us a thumbs up, review, and we'll be back in a few days with the final 3-episode discussion. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you. May the Force be with us.